I have kept a personal log for 31 years. Cattle counts, weather patterns, the particular mood of the land when something is about to change. I have written down the deaths of men I respected, the births of calves I named, the slow deterioration of a fence line that finally collapsed on a Tuesday in March. I am not a man given to sentiment or spectacle, and I will tell you plainly that I did not expect to write what I am about to write. But I watched it happen. I stood 40 feet from the church steps with dirt on my boots and a cattleman's eye for what is real and what is performance. And I am telling you, what James Calloway did on the morning of August the 9th, in the year of our Lord 1887, was neither spectacle nor performance. It was something I do not have a precise word for. I have asked the Apache elder Nate, a man who has seen more of human nature than most men ever will, what word his people use for a person who absorbs a great wound and transforms it into something that feeds others. He thought for a long time before he answered. He said the word was something like Nantan, but not exactly. He said it was a word for a person who bleeds in a direction that waters the ground. I have been thinking about that word ever since. What follows is my account. I have written it in 3 parts because that is how it happened, in 3 separate waves, each one knocking the breath from me before I had fully recovered from the last. I have tried to be accurate. I have tried not to explain too much. Some things, I have decided, a reader ought to feel before they understand. The day James Calloway was supposed to get married, I was fixing a broken wheel spoke on my supply wagon outside Dunfield's hardware store, and I was thinking about nothing more profound than whether I had ordered enough salt block before the dry season hit full force. That is the truth of how ordinary days begin before they stop being ordinary. The church was 3 buildings down from Dunfield's, a whitewashed frame building with a bell that always rang slightly flat, like something in it was just a hair loose, and no one could be bothered to fix it properly. I had been aware, in the peripheral way a man is aware of traffic noise, that there was a wedding happening that morning. James Calloway, 28 years old, foreman of the Raftersea spread, was marrying a woman named Clara Eames who had come down from Denver 2 years prior and set up a seamstress shop on Merchant Street. I knew James to nod at. I knew Clara Eames by reputation. A careful woman, people said. Precise. She hemmed a trouser leg to within a 1/16 of an inch and never charged for the restitch if she got it wrong. I had no particular stake in the wedding. I was threading a new spoke through the hub and listening to my own breathing and the distant flat bell calling people to witness, and I was not thinking about any of it. Then the church doors opened. Not at the end, not with the rice and the shouting. The doors opened maybe 20 minutes after the bell had gone quiet, which is to say 20 minutes into what should have been the ceremony, and a woman in a white dress came out of them moving the way water moves when a dam gives way. Not running exactly, but not walking either, with a momentum that seemed less chosen than inevitable. Clara Eames. She had her skirts bunched in both hands, and she was coming down those church steps the way a person comes down steps when they have made a decision so completely that their body has already begun executing it before their mind has caught up. She did not look left or right. She did not look back. She walked to the hitching post outside the church where a gray horse named Fletcher, I would learn the horse's name later, from James himself, had been tied as part of the post-ceremony celebration procession, and she untied him, and she mounted him in that white dress, which is a thing I had never seen a woman do before and have not seen since, and she rode south toward the canyon road at a pace that said she was not going to stop for a conversation. Nobody moved for a moment. I stopped threading the spoke. The congregation began to emerge from the church in the slow, uncertain way people emerge from buildings when the situation has changed faster than their comprehension. Women in their good dresses, men in their best coats. The minister, with his book still open, standing at the top of the steps with an expression that was trying very hard not to be the expression it was. And then James Calloway came through those doors. I want to describe him accurately because this is important. He was not a large man, but he carried himself with the kind of economy that suggests everything is deliberate. He had dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had been set a long time ago and not shifted since, and he was wearing a suit that I could tell even from 40 feet away had been purchased specifically for this day and would likely never be worn again. He stood at the top of the church steps and he watched Clara Eames until she disappeared around the bend where the main road curved south, and during that time, I counted, from some observer's instinct I cannot explain, He stood there for almost 45 seconds without moving. The congregation was murmuring. Someone touched his arm. He didn't flinch, but he didn't respond either. Then he turned around and looked at the people gathered on those steps and in the yard, and he said something. I was too far away to hear the words, but I could read the shape of his face, and what his face was doing was not collapsing. It was not going rigid with anger. It was doing something more complicated than either of those things. It was absorbing. Like a man who has just been told the river is going to flood, and is already calculating which livestock to move first. I finished threading the spoke. I told myself I had no business watching another man's private catastrophe. I kept watching. My name is Orrin Bassett. I have kept a log since I was 17 years old, when my father gave me a leather-bound journal and told me that a man who doesn't record his own days will wake up at 50 and discover he has lived someone else's. I am 43 now, and I have filled 22 such journals, which I keep in a tin box under my bunk with a rusted latch that I have been meaning to fix for 8 years. I run a modest cattle operation 12 miles north of town on land I have been slowly buying back from the bank in installments since the drought of 1882 took most of what I had built. I have no wife. I had one, briefly. She left for her sisters in Albuquerque in 1879 and sent a letter 3 months later that was very kind and very final. I do not write about her in my logs. I write around the space she occupied, which amounts to the same thing. I mention all this because I want to be clear about the kind of man I am. The kind who watches and records and does not often intervene. The kind who believes that most human events proceed according to their own logic, and that intervention is usually more about the intervener's comfort than the situation's need. But something about James Calloway on those steps would not let me look away. What he did was this. He turned back to the congregation and he spoke to them again, more words this time longer with gestures that were small and controlled, and then he went back into the church. The congregation followed him slowly, like they weren't sure if this was what they were supposed to do but couldn't think of a better option. The minister last, still with the book open, looking at the road Clara Eames had ridden down. I finished with the wagon spoke. I went into Dunfield's to pay my account. Old Dunfield himself was at the counter, which was unusual. He normally had a boy named Epperson handling transactions while he did inventory in the back. He was standing with his hands flat on the counter, looking out the window at the church. "What happened?" I said, though I had largely seen it myself. "Clara Eames left," he said, like he was reading from a report. "I saw that." James went back in and told everyone to sit down. He shook his head slowly. Said the food was paid for and the music was paid for, and he didn't see any reason for it all to go to waste. I put my money on the counter. He said that. Said there's no law against a celebration without a wedding. Dunfield finally looked at me. He was a man in his 60s with the kind of face that has seen enough that it doesn't often show surprise. It was showing something close to it now. Said everybody came a long way and put on their good clothes, and he wasn't going to send them home without a meal. I stood there with my hand still on the money. And they stayed. Every one of them, Dunfield said. Can you imagine? I could not at first. I tried to reconstruct it in my mind as I drove the wagon back north toward my land. James Calloway standing in a church where he was supposed to have just been married, addressing the people who had witnessed his public abandonment, and choosing to respond to that wound not with dismissal or rage or the dignified collapse that most men would have elected, but with hospitality, with the insistence that the day should not be wasted. It struck me as either the bravest thing I had ever heard of or the strangest, and I could not yet determine which. I pulled the wagon over at the top of the first ridge, where I can see town spread below me like a thing spilled on a tablecloth, and I wrote in my log, James Calloway was left at the altar this morning. He invited the wedding guests to stay for the celebration anyway. I do not know what to make of this, writing it down so I don't forget the shape of it. Then I drove home. The Apache camp was 9 miles from my northeast fence line. I say camp loosely. It had been there for going on 4 years, which in my experience means it was more than a camp and less than what most people would call a settlement. There were perhaps 30 people, sometimes more, sometimes fewer as small groups moved and returned according to patterns I had only begun to understand. The elder I spoke with most often was a man named Nate, which was not his full ceremonial name, but the portion of it he offered to men like me. He was perhaps 60 years old, with a face that had been exposed to decades of high desert sun, until it had taken on a quality like old leather that had been oiled, and finally achieved a kind of permanent suppleness. I had a trading relationship with the camp that had begun as practical necessity. My northeastern range abutted their traditional travel routes, and conflict there would have cost me cattle and cost them passage, and we had both quietly decided that the smarter arrangement was commerce. I brought tools, occasionally medicines, salt, and sugar. They brought me intelligence about water sources, whether coming from the south, and on 3 occasions, information about cattle thieves working my back range that had saved me significant losses. What I had not anticipated, when this arrangement began, was that Nate would prove to be among the most penetrating observers of human behavior I had ever encountered. He had a quality of attention that I associated with very good trackers, a complete and unhurried focus on whatever was in front of him, combined with a patience for letting information accumulate before drawing conclusions. He asked questions that seemed simple and were not. He had a way of sitting with silence that made it feel inhabited rather than empty. I had told him about Clara Eames and James Calloway on my next supply run, 3 days after the wedding, that wasn't. I don't know entirely why, partly because Nate always seemed to know when I was withholding something that was occupying my thoughts, and the withholding cost more energy than the telling. Partly because I genuinely wanted a perspective that wasn't shaped by the same town gossip and assumptions I had been swimming in for 3 days. I told it plainly. The church, the doors, the woman in white on the gray horse, the 45 seconds of stillness, the decision to stay for the celebration. Nate listened. He was working a piece of rawhide through his hands as I talked, a slow, repetitive motion that I had come to understand was not distraction but its opposite, the physical equivalent of taking notes. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "He did not go after her," he said finally. "No. He did not send anyone after her." "No." Another silence. "What do the people in your town think of him now?" This was a question I had been wrestling with for 3 days. The answer was complicated. There was sympathy, certainly. There was also a particular kind of respect that was tinged with something I could only describe as discomfort, the way people sometimes look at a thing that makes them quietly examine their own capacity for it. "Some think he was putting on a face," I said, "showing everyone he wasn't broken." "And you?" I looked at the middle distance, where my northeastern fence line disappeared into the scrub cedar. "I don't think he was unbroken," I said carefully. "I think he was broken and acting anyway." Nate turned the rawhide in his hands. "Yes," he said, with a satisfaction that suggested this was a distinction that mattered to him considerably. I drove back into town 2 days later for a second supply run. I had underestimated my salt block needs, as I had feared, and I stopped at the Eagle's Rest lunch counter because I had started early and my breakfast had been inadequate, and because I knew the Eagle's Rest was where the town's information circulated most freely. What I learned there, over a plate of eggs that were marginally better than what I made at home, was this. James Calloway had given Fletcher, the gray horse, to Clara's younger brother, with a note that said the horse hadn't done anything wrong and deserved a good home. He had settled the accounts for the wedding dinner with the hotel himself, declining to hold the caterer responsible for circumstances beyond anyone's prediction. He had returned to his foreman duties at the Raftersea the morning after the wedding, without explanation or discussion, and had been working his regular hours since. The Raftersea's owner, a man named August Beale who was not known for sentimentality, had reportedly told his wife that James was the finest foreman he had ever employed, and that watching James handle this situation had confirmed it. Clara Eames had not returned. There was a letter, I was told, received by her sister in town that said she was well and that she was sorry and that she hoped James would understand in time. No one seemed to know what she was sorry for specifically or what she expected James to understand. The letter did not explain. I wrote all of this in my log that evening. At the bottom I added, "There is something happening here that I don't have a complete frame for. Not heroism exactly. Something more interior than heroism. Like watching a man deal with a river flood by building a better levee instead of cursing the rain." Then I went to sleep and dreamed about the spoke I had replaced, which had already been tested by the road and held. 6 weeks after the wedding, I encountered James Calloway face to face for the first time. It was at the Raftersea's North Water Trough, which was close enough to my property line that both of us had occasion to be there. There was an informal easement arrangement between myself and August Beale that had existed since before I bought the land. I was checking the water level for my northern herd. James was inspecting the trough's caulking, which had been weeping for a season. We were introduced by the terrain rather than by choice. He looked, I thought, like a man who was tired in a specific way that sleep doesn't fully address, not physically diminished, but with something behind his eyes that was working harder than it should have to for an ordinary afternoon inspection. He was wearing work clothes, no trace of the wedding suit. He had the unhurried competence of a man who is good at his job and knows it without needing it acknowledged. We talked about the water trough. We talked about the caulking compound and whether horsehair in the mixture was still the best approach or whether there was something newer worth trying. We talked about the dry summer and what it was likely to do to the grass come September. I did not mention the wedding. It was not my place, and I did not think he wanted it mentioned. But as I was gathering my reins to go, he said, without looking up from the caulking he was pressing into a gap with his thumb, "I heard you saw it, the morning." I stopped. "I did," I said. He pressed the caulking in, smoothed it, looked at the result with the focused appraisal of a craftsman checking his own work. "People keep asking me if I'm all right," he said, like it's a question with an answer. I didn't say anything to that. He looked up at me then. His eyes were a dark gray-brown that in that light had the quality of still water over a deep bottom. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I just meant you were there. Sometimes it matters that someone saw a thing." I understood what he meant. I had spent 31 years writing things down so they would be witnessed, even if only by the paper. The need to have a thing acknowledged by someone other than yourself was not weakness. It was something more fundamental than that. "I saw it," I said again. "I wrote it down." He held my gaze for a moment. Something in his face shifted, not broke, not opened, but adjusted. Like a door that has been slightly ajar finally finding the right position against the frame. "Good," he said, and went back to the caulking. I drove home and wrote in my log, "James Calloway knows I saw him. He didn't need comfort. He needed to not be invisible." There is a difference, and most people don't know what it is. Nate came on a Thursday morning, which I know precisely because my log says so. Thursday, October the 3rd, 1887. And I had been awake since before dawn dealing with a heifer that had positioned her calf wrong and needed assistance that cost me 2 hours, and the skin off my right forearm before it resolved itself satisfactorily. I was at the pump behind the barn washing my arm when I saw him coming across my east pasture. He walked with the particular unhurried stride of a man who has covered long distances on foot for enough years that the motion has become completely efficient. No energy wasted on pace or urgency, just the accumulation of ground beneath feet that know what they are doing. I watched him come. I finished cleaning my arm. I went inside and put coffee on because whatever Nate had walked 9 miles to say was going to require that we sit down. He came in without ceremony. We had been past ceremony for about 2 years by then, and he sat in the chair by the window that he always took, the one that let him see both the east pasture and the road to the south. He did not look at either today. He looked at his hands. "There is a problem," he said when the coffee was poured. "What kind?" "The kind that involves your town and my camp and a man I think you know." He looked up. "James Calloway." I put my cup down. "Tell me." The thing I had not known, had not thought to know, had not had reason to look for, was that James Calloway had been riding south. Since the wedding, not chasing Clara Eames, she had gone east toward Denver, and James showed no sign of following. But south, toward the canyon country where Nature's camp sat between 2 red walls in a landscape that most men from town avoided because it was difficult terrain with no clear profit in it. He had been coming for 3 weeks, Nate said. Not every day. 3 or 4 times a week, in the early morning before his foreman duties required him at the Raftersea, he came to a particular rocky bench above the canyon where you could see a long way south and sit in the early light without being seen from the road or from town. Nature's people had watched him. They watched everyone who came near the canyon, which was prudent given their history with men from town who arrived with purposes other than they stated. For 3 weeks they had watched James Calloway sit on that bench in the early morning and look south, and he had brought nothing and done nothing and taken nothing. And eventually a young man from the camp named D, who had a reckless quality that Nate described with obvious affection and mild exasperation, had climbed up to the bench one morning and sat down next to him. "What did James do?" I said. "Nothing for a while," Nate said. Then he asked the boy's name. The boy told him. The boy asked James what he was looking at. Nate's expression shifted slightly, a compression of the lines around his eyes that I had learned to read as something between amusement and a more complex feeling. James said he was looking at nothing in particular. He was just looking at something that was not what he had expected it to be. I thought about that. Dee said that is like looking for a deer trail after the deer have moved, Nate continued. James asked what he meant. Dee said, the trail is still there, but it goes nowhere useful now. A man who keeps looking at it is not looking at the land, he is looking at his own memory. I picked up my coffee. It had gone slightly cool. And James laughed, Nate said. Dee said it was a real laugh. Not the kind people make when they are performing. He paused. Dee liked him after that. The problem, as Nate laid it out with the methodical precision of a man who has had to explain complicated situations to people with incomplete maps many times, was this. Word had gotten to someone in town that a man from the Raftersea was making regular visits to the canyon country. The interpretation that had been applied to this information was not charitable. There was a water dispute simmering between the town council and the territorial government about the canyon creek that fed the southern range, and someone had decided that James Calloway's morning rides were connected to this dispute in some way, that he was meeting with Apache representatives to negotiate access to water that the town believed was its by prior claim. None of this was true, but truth, as I had observed many times, moves slower than assumption. The specific danger was that August Beale, James's employer, the man who had reportedly praised his character to his wife, had been told this interpretation and had accepted it provisionally, in the way that men accept things that confirm existing anxieties. There was already tension between the Raftersea and the canyon country over grazing boundaries. Beale was not, at his core, a hostile man, but he was a man with investments to protect, and the story he had been given was one that threatened those investments. Nate had heard this through the particular network of information that I will not describe in detail here, partly because I don't fully understand it, and partly because it was not mine to describe. What I understood was, word would reach Beale that his foreman was meeting with Apache leadership about water rights, and Beale would confront James, and the confrontation would happen before James had any opportunity to explain the truth, which was simply that a broken man had been sitting on a rock looking south, and a boy named D had made him laugh. "Why are you telling me?" I said. Nate looked at me with the patience of a man who has answered obvious questions many times and has made peace with the need to do so. "Because you know James Calloway," he said, "and because you saw him on the steps." "I barely know him." "You know the kind of man he is?" Nate wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "D is 17 years old, and he has seen enough bad things happen to good men through misunderstanding that he does not sleep well some nights. He does not want this man, who laughed at his deer trail story like someone who had just remembered something he had forgotten, to lose his position because of a wrong story about him. I looked out the window. The east pasture was green still, just barely, the last hold of summer before the autumn grass came in dry. A couple of the Hereford cows were grazing near the fence line, moving with the slow indifference of animals whose needs are met. "And you walked 9 miles to tell me this instead of handling it some other way," I said. "I walked 9 miles, Nate said, because the other ways available to me would likely make things worse, and because you are the kind of man who writes things down, which means you are the kind of man who understands that what gets said about an event is not always what the event was." I drove to the Raftersea that afternoon. I want to be precise about my emotional state during that drive, because it has bearing on what happened and why. I was uncomfortable. I was a man who watched and recorded and did not typically intervene, and I was being asked to intervene. And not only that, I was being asked to intervene on behalf of a man I barely knew at the request of an Apache elder I knew better, in a situation I had entered only by accident of geography and timing and a broken wagon spoke. I was 43 years old, and my instinct for self-preservation was well developed, and the self it was most practiced at preserving was the one that stayed at the edges of things. But Nate had said, "You know the kind of man he is." And I did. I had watched him absorb something that should have knocked him sideways, and instead turn toward the people around him and say, "The food is paid for, the music is paid for, there's no reason to waste the day." I had watched him press caulking into a water trough with his thumb and say, "Sometimes it matters that someone saw a thing." I had heard about him giving a horse to a boy with a note saying the horse hadn't done anything wrong. These were not the actions of a man performing dignity. These were the actions of a man who had looked at what he had left and decided to use it carefully. I had also, in some part of me I had not examined closely, been thinking about my own tin box under the bunk, and the journals, and the woman who had gone to Albuquerque in 1879, and the space in the logs where her name should have been but wasn't. I had been thinking about whether the writing around rather than through was its own form of looking at a deer trail that leads nowhere. I drove to the Raftersea. August Beale received me in his study, which was a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and the particular dusty warmth of papers that have been worked through many times. He was a broad man in his late 50s with a white beard he kept neatly trimmed, and the measured speech of someone who has learned to value precision over speed in conversation. I had met him 3 or 4 times in the course of ordinary business dealings. He knew me as Orrin Bassett, the fellow with the cattle operation on the North Range, reliable for accounts, not a troublemaker. I told him without embellishment what Nate had told me. I said, "James Calloway has been riding to the canyon bench in the mornings not for any purpose connected to water rights or grazing boundaries or any arrangement with the Apache camp. He has been riding there because he is a man dealing with something difficult, and the view is long and open, and a boy named D made him laugh, and those 2 things together are apparently what he needed." Beale listened. He was quiet for a long time when I finished. "Who told you this?" he said. "The elder Nate. He walked 9 miles to find me this morning." Beale absorbed this. Why would he do that? Because his camp has been watching Calloway for 3 weeks, and they've concluded he's a decent man who is in some trouble through no fault of his own, and decent men in trouble through no fault of their own are something they have reason to care about. Beale looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read, then looked out the window. "I'd heard a story," he said, "about water rights. I know the story is wrong." "How wronged?" "Entirely." Another silence. Then, "James hasn't said a word to me, not about where he's going in the mornings, not about any of it." "He probably didn't think it needed explaining," I said. "Men who aren't doing anything wrong often don't." Beale turned back to me. The expression had settled into something more legible now, not relief exactly, but the loosening of a held tension. "I was going to speak to him tomorrow morning," he said. "I thought you might be." He looked at me. "Why does it matter to you, Bassett?" I thought about Nature's phrase, the word that meant someone who bleeds in a direction that waters the ground. I thought about the 45 seconds on the church steps. I thought about a caulking compound and a water trough, and the specific quality of being seen by someone who then writes it down. "I saw him," I said, "on the morning I was there." Beale nodded slowly, like this was, against all expectation, a sufficient explanation. I stopped at the canyon bench on my way back north. I don't know entirely why. Some intersection of impulse and the gathering dark, and the fact that I had driven past the turnoff before I had made a conscious decision about it. The bench was empty. James would have been back at the Raftersea for hours by now. But you could see it from the road if you pulled the wagon over and walked up the short slope of loose red rock to where the bench jutted out over the canyon. I did that. I stood where he had been sitting. The view was what Nate had said, long and open. To the south, the canyon country spread out in layered reds and ochres, the shadows beginning to pool in the lower cuts as the sun moved west, the sky above still a high clear blue that had that particular late afternoon quality of light that lands differently than morning light, less hopeful and more honest. I understood why a man would come here. I stood there for a while, my boots on the red rock, looking south, and I thought about the letter Clara Eames had sent. I hope James will understand in time. And I thought about what she might have meant, and about understanding, which is a thing that mostly happens later than you want it to and differently than you expected. I thought about Dee and the Deer Trail. I took out my log and wrote, standing on the bench above the canyon where James Calloway has been coming for 3 weeks. I can see why. Some things you have to look at from a distance before they stop hurting long enough for you to understand their shape. I put the log away and walked back down to the wagon. On the way back north, I passed a rabbit sitting in the middle of the road. It sat there for a full 3 seconds, looking at me with the absolute unblinking attention of a creature that has no context for wagon wheels, and then it was gone into the scrub. I did not write that down, some things you just let pass. James Calloway was not fired. I know this because I passed August Beale on the main street 2 days later and he stopped his horse and said simply, "Sorted," and rode on. That was all. Beale was not a man who used 2 words where one would do. What I did not know, what I found out later, and what properly belongs to the account, was what happened between James and Nate after. It was Dee who told me, on a supply run 2 weeks later when Nate was occupied with something requiring his attention elsewhere, and Dee, who was 17 and had not yet developed the economy of speech that age and circumstance would eventually install in him, came out to help me unload and decided to narrate the recent history of his camp in considerable detail. James had gone to the camp, not to the bench, to the camp itself. He had come on a morning when the light was still low and cold, and he had asked, at the camp's edge, if Nate would see him. He had been received in the formal way reserved for visitors whose purpose was not yet known. He had brought nothing. He had made no arrangement. He had sat with Nate for an hour in the way that Nate sits with people, in the quiet that is inhabited rather than empty, and at the end of it he had said, according to Dee's account, "I don't know what the right words are for thanking a man for what you did. I don't know if there are right words, but I wanted to come here myself." Nate had said, "You have been sitting on our bench looking south for 3 weeks. We thought it was polite to look after the bench's condition." James had laughed. Dee said it was the same laugh as the Deer Trail, real from somewhere behind the performance of everything else. Then James had said, "Who is the man with the wagon who came to see Beale?" Nate had said, "A man named Orrin Bassett, he keeps logs." James had been quiet for a moment. Then, "He was at the church, wasn't he, the morning?" "I believe so." James had nodded. He had looked at his hands, and then he had looked at the red canyon walls around the camp, and he had said something that Dee reported with the careful exactness of a young person who has recognized, even without fully understanding, that this is a sentence worth preserving. "I didn't think anyone was really watching that morning. I thought I was just doing what needed to be done and nobody was particularly watching." Nate had said, "Men who do what needs to be done without performing it are always the ones being watched." And James had said, "That's a frightening thing." And Nate had said, "Yes, it is meant to be." I put that exchange in my log. I put it in there complete without my commentary, which was unusual for me. I am, as established, a man given to annotation. But some things don't need annotation. They need to be set down plain and left there with white space around them, like an object placed on a clean surface so you can really see what it is. What I added after a break of 3 lines was this: I have been writing around things for 8 years. I think I may have been looking at a deer trail. Then I closed the log and sat for a while in the quiet. The winter of 1887 into 1888 was hard in the particular way that winters are hard in high desert country. Not with the killing cold of the north, but with a gray, relentless dryness that parched the air and cracked the soil and made everything feel provisional and exposed. My northeastern herd did well enough. The cattle are a hardy line, bought from stock that had already proved itself against one bad drought, and I had laid in enough supplemental feed in October to see them through. The levee held as I had built it to. I was in town twice a month for supply runs, and the inevitable accumulation of whatever news the Eagle's Rest lunch counter was processing. The news about James Calloway was no longer front and center by October. Towns have a natural news cycle, and James had declined to provide new material, which eventually exhausted the topic. By November, he was simply a man working his regular hours at the Raftersea, which was about as invisible as a man can be while still being present. What I observed on the occasions I had reason to see him was the slow, almost geological process of someone rebuilding an interior structure. It does not look dramatic. It looks like a man buying supplies at Dunfield's. It looks like a man having a reasonable conversation about grazing rotation at the Eagle's Rest. It looks from the outside like nothing in particular, which is precisely how you can tell it's real. He had been introduced at some point in November to a widow named Josephine Harker who ran the feed store on the east end of Merchant Street following her husband's death from a lung illness 2 years prior. I knew her slightly. She was a woman of practical intelligence who had taken over the feed store accounts with a competence that had surprised people who expected her to struggle, and who had apparently not been interested in being surprised about. I did not know through the winter whether this introduction was developing into anything. It was not my business. But I noticed, on my December supply run, that James was leaving Dunfield's at the same time I was arriving, and he had a bag of flour and a separate paper-wrapped parcel from the feed store, and he was walking back toward the livery with a purpose in his step that had a different quality than the careful, conserved movement I had been watching since August. Purpose has a particular signature. I have been watching people long enough to recognize it. I wrote in my log that evening, James Calloway has a different walk. Hard to describe precisely. Something in him has moved forward. I don't know the particulars, but I trust the walk. I went to the canyon bench once more in January, on a day when a rare light snow had dusted the red rock, and the air was so clear it had a ringing quality, like the inside of a bell right after it's been struck. I don't know why I went. The pull of a place is not always explicable. James was not there, but Dee was. He was sitting on the bench with his knees up and his arms resting on them, and he was looking south with that particular quality of attention that I recognized now as something specific to his camp. Not vacant, not purposeful, but receiving, like a man waiting for information that he knows is coming and cannot be hurried. He heard me coming and turned, and recognized me without particular surprise, as if he had been vaguely expecting that I might appear. I sat down next to him. We looked south together for a while. "Is Nate well?" I said. "He is well." Dee was quiet for a moment. "He said to tell you if I saw you that he has been thinking about your logs." "What about them?" He said, "A man who writes things down is making an argument that the things happened and mattered. He said he thinks you have been making this argument for a long time about things you did not know you believed in." I looked at the red canyon walls, the snow on the upper ledges, the long view south that had been giving James Calloway something he needed through the fall. "He's not wrong," I said. Dee nodded. He had the quality, unusual in someone 17, of being comfortable with confirmation, not needing to expand on it or redirect it or fill the space it created. We sat for a while longer. Then Dee said, "The man with the laugh came back 2 weeks ago." "James Calloway?" "Yes, he brought Nate something, a tool for working leather, good quality, not new, which means he found it deliberately, not just bought what was available." Dee turned to look at me. His eyes had the dark, alert quality of someone who is always filing observations. He said, "I learned that your people were watching this bench to keep it safe. I thought it was right to bring something for the watching." I absorbed that. "Nate said," Dee continued, with the slight formality of someone delivering a message with care, "a man who is not broken would have brought a gift because it is custom. A man who is becoming unbroken brings a gift because he has figured out the actual shape of what he owes." I turned that over in my mind. The distinction between the two was precise, and when I understood it, obvious, the way the best distinctions always are. A man acting from convention, a man acting from genuine reckoning. The same action, two entirely different origins, and the difference mattered even if no one watching from outside could see it. "Did James understand what Nate said?" "He was quiet for a while," Dee said. "Then he said he would think about the distinction. Nate said that was the right answer." The snow on the upper ledges was beginning to melt at its edges in the mid-morning sun. I could hear the faint sound of it dripping somewhere below the bench. "How is your sleeping?" I asked. Nate had mentioned months ago that Dee didn't sleep well. Dee considered the question with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "Better," he said. "I think mostly because this came out right." "This?" "The man with the laugh," Dee said simply. "When things come out right for people who deserve them to, it helps with sleep." Spring arrived in that country the way it always does. Not all at once, but in a series of small capitulations by the cold, each one tentative, as if the winter is not entirely convinced it should be leaving yet. The scrub cedar came green first, at the tips of its branches, and then the bunch grass on the south slopes, and then the morning air began to have a different quality, warmer and somehow more permissive, the way the air in a room changes when a window is finally opened. My herd had wintered well. 14 new calves by March. 3 of them I named, which is a habit I have never been able to entirely abandon despite its impracticality. A rancher should not name cattle, but there are 3 or 4 in every generation that develop personalities that make the refusal feel dishonest. I went to town on the 15th of April for the first major supply run of the season, which always has a slightly festive quality after the winter's economies. More people on the street, more voices from the storefronts, the particular pleasure of buying what you want rather than what you absolutely need. I was at Dunfield's working through my list when I heard the bell of the door and looked up, and James Calloway came in with Josephine Harker. They were not holding hands. They were not demonstrably anything. But they were walking with the close proximity of people who have been in each other's space long enough that the space itself has adjusted. The specific gravitational arrangement of 2 people who have chosen each other, even if they have not yet announced it. James saw me at the same moment I registered who had come in. Something in his face acknowledged the recognition, a slight adjustment in the set of his expression, not quite a smile and not quite something else, a private notation. I nodded, he nodded. Josephine Harker was examining a display of rope grades near the window and did not see the exchange. I went back to my list. Dunfield was counting out my order in the back. I heard James and Josephine discussing something about fencing materials in the low, practical tone of people who are engaged in the ordinary work of building something and find it deeply unfrightening to do so together. That tone is distinctive. I have heard it in my life very rarely. It sounds like capability that doesn't need to announce itself. I paid for my supplies and carried the first load out to the wagon, and on my second trip back I passed James near the door and he stopped me. "Bassett," he said. "Calloway." He was quiet for a moment. There was something he wanted to say, and he was choosing the words with the same careful deliberateness he had pressed caulking into a water trough. "I heard what you did," he said finally. "Last fall, with Beale. It was—" "I know it was nothing to you," he said, before I could complete whatever diminishing I was about to do. "I know it cost you something anyway. Most things that aren't nothing cost something anyway." He held my gaze. "I appreciate it." I stood there with my second box of supplies. "There's a boy named D," I said, "who told me you had a laugh that sounded real. He was the one who asked for help. I was just the man available." James considered this. "Then I appreciate him too," he said. "I'll find a way to say so." I believed him. Finding ways to say things was, I had come to understand, one of the things James Calloway was good at. Not in a smooth or practiced way, but in the careful, material way of someone who treats words the way a good rancher treats water, as something too valuable to waste and too necessary to withhold. I went to see Nate in early May. I brought the usual supplies. I also brought, wrapped in cloth, a leather-bound journal, not one of my used ones but a new one, purchased specifically at the stationer's on Merchant Street. I had thought for a long time about whether this was the right thing to bring, and had eventually decided that the overthinking was the problem, not the solution. Nate received it with the focused attention he gave to everything, turning it over in his hands, examining the binding, opening it to look at the blank pages with an expression I could not read and did not try to. "You write in these," he said. "Yes. Every day. Most days, the ones that have something worth recording." He turned it over again. "What do you write when nothing has happened?" I thought about this. "I write what I'm thinking about," I said. "What I'm watching, what I don't have a word for yet." Nate was quiet for a moment. "Then everything is worth recording," he said, "because you are always thinking. Always watching. That might be true." He set the journal on his knee with a careful respect that I found, unexpectedly, moving. "James Calloway came again last week," he said. "I heard he was going too. He sat with me for 2 hours. We talked about—" Nate paused, with the deliberateness of someone selecting the accurate word from a field of approximate ones. "The question of how a man decides what to do after a thing has changed that he expected to remain fixed." I leaned forward slightly, What did you tell him? I told him what I believe. Nate looked at me with the quality of attention that always made me feel slightly transparent, like a man who has been observed long enough that his patterns are legible. I told him that the fixed thing was never actually fixed, that we believe things are permanent because we need to plan, and planning requires the assumption of stability. But the land does not plan. The land simply is, and then it changes, and then it is something else. A man who can hold his plans lightly enough to revise them when the land changes, that man is neither weak nor lost. He is accurate. I thought about the deer trail, the trail that leads nowhere now because the deer have moved. And James... Nature's expression shifted to the compression around his eyes that meant the thing close to amusement. James said, "That is either very wise or very frightening." He paused. I said, "Yes." In June, there was a gathering at the Raftersea. August Beale held these once or twice a year. Not formal occasions, just a bringing together of the people and operations connected to the ranch, with food and conversation, and occasionally music from a fiddle player named Corrigan who had a gift for finding the precise emotional register of an evening and playing directly to it. I was invited, which surprised me mildly, and went. James was there in the capacity of host adjacent, as the Raftersea's foreman, keeping things running smoothly, managing the logistics of food and drink and the particular social traffic of a gathering with multiple intersecting groups. He did this with the same economy he brought to everything. No waste, no performance, precise application of effort where it was needed. Josephine Harker was there. By June, I think everyone in the relevant circles understood the arrangement, even without formal announcement. She worked the gathering with an independence that had nothing apologetic about it. She was her own person at the event, in conversation with multiple people, comfortable in the space on her own terms. When she and James crossed paths in the natural flow of the evening, there was a brief exchange. A word, a shared look, nothing public, that had the quality of two people who have established a private language and don't need to speak it loudly. I watched this. I wrote nothing, having left my log at home because I had decided deliberately to practice attending to an evening without immediately translating it into words. The practice was more difficult than I had expected. My instinct for notation is deep. But I stayed with it. Near the end of the evening, Corrigan shifted into something slower and more interior, and the gathering's energy quieted around it. People moved into smaller conversations. The lamplight settled. I found myself standing near the edge of the porch with a cup of cider, looking out at the dark grass of the north pasture, and James came to stand next to me, not because we had arranged it, but because it was where the evening's natural flow had brought us both. We stood there for a moment without talking. The fiddle was doing something in a minor key that had a longing in it that felt appropriate for the long view into the dark. "You went back to the bench," James said. "Once or twice." "I haven't been in a while," he was quiet. "I don't think I need to go back." I thought about that, about what it meant for a place to be used up in the right way, not abandoned but completed. The bench above the canyon had given him what it could give, and he had taken it, and it was done. "Dee still goes," I said. "I know," something in his voice was warm. "Nate told me the boy sleeps better now. He didn't explain why and I didn't ask, but I think I know." I thought of Dee on the bench in the January snow. When things come out right for people who deserve them to, it helps with sleep. "He's a good kid," I said. "He is," James said. "Then I'm going to talk to Josephine." I understood what he meant, the particular talk that was not the talking they had been doing for months, but the specific conversation with a particular weight and consequence. "When?" "Soon," he looked out at the dark pasture. "I'm not in a hurry, but I'm not afraid of it either, which is different from where I was." He paused. "I think I was more afraid before August than I understood, of what it meant to be that certain about something and then be wrong." I thought about the 45 seconds on the church steps, the absorption, the turn back toward the congregation. "You weren't wrong about everything," I said. He looked at me. "Who Clara was, whether she could make that trip, maybe you were wrong about that. But the rest of it, the food being paid for, the music being paid for, the guests coming a long way in their good clothes, you were right about that." He was quiet for a moment. "The day not having to be a waste," he said, like he was setting the words down carefully. "Yes, I was right about that." The fiddle shifted into something slightly brighter, and somewhere behind us Corrigan began to play a tune that I recognized from another gathering, 3 or 4 years prior, and one of the older women began to clap time, and the evening gathered itself into a different shape. Lighter, moving, the specific social warmth of people who have found each other in a good space, and are not ready yet to let the evening end. I drove home that night under a sky that had the particular depth of early summer, the stars more numerous than they ever look in winter, as if the cold compresses them and the warmth lets them spread. My horse, a steady gray mare named June, moved with the placid confidence of an animal that knows the road home and requires no guidance. I let her find it. I thought about nature's word, the one that means someone who bleeds in a direction that waters the ground. I thought about all the specific ways James Calloway had bled in that direction over the past 10 months. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the persistent, practical, unperforming quality of a man who had looked at what was left after the flood and decided to build with it. I thought about my own tin box with the rusted latch, the journals, the writing around rather than through, the space in the record where a name should be. I had been at the edges of things for a long time. It was a position with real advantages. You see more, you risk less. You maintain a kind of integrity that comes from not being too involved to be accurate. But there is a thing the edges cannot give you, and I had been watching James Calloway find it through the fall and winter and into the spring, and the watching had been doing something to me in the slow, geological, unannounced way that things actually change. June found the turn north without being asked. There is one more thing to record. On the 22nd of June, I went to see Nate. Not for supplies, not for information or for the particular clarity his conversations provided, though those things were always present. I went because I had decided to take the old journal out of the tin box, the 1879 one, the year the letter came from Albuquerque, and to read what I had written around rather than through, to look at the shape of the space. I had done this before leaving my ranch that morning. I had sat at my table with the journal open, and I had read the entries from that year, which were full of cattle counts, and weather notes and fence line assessments, and a deliberate, thorough, professional attention to everything except what was actually happening. What I found, underneath all of that careful writing around, was this: the record of a man who had been paying attention to the wrong things for the right reasons, and who had never quite noticed that the lens had been pointed in the wrong direction. I closed the journal. I put it back in the tin box. I did not fix the latch. I drove to the canyon. Nate was outside his camp, working in the morning light with a piece of wood he was shaping into something I could not identify yet. He looked up when he heard me coming and did not look surprised, because Nate almost never looks surprised, though I believe he is sometimes. I sat down. We were quiet for a while. The canyon walls were their morning red, which is the deepest and most saturated they get, a color that looks almost internal, like something warm behind it. I read the old journal, I said. He set the wood down, looked at me with that quality of complete attention. What did you find? What I had avoided writing, I said, which means it was there anyway, just in the negative space. He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes, the absence is also a record. I looked at the canyon walls. I think I've been watching things the way you can watch a fire from across the room, I said, near enough to feel the warmth, far enough to not have to decide anything about it. Nate picked up the wood again, turned it in his hands, and now. I did not have a complete answer to that. I had the beginning of one, which I thought was probably sufficient for where I was. I told him the beginning. He listened, he turned the wood. He said nothing for a while, which was his way of saying, yes, that seems right, continue from there. The morning moved around us. The light shifted on the canyon walls, incremental, the way real change moves, nothing you can point to at any given second and say there, that was the moment, but indisputable across the span of an hour, or a season, or a year. I stayed for 2 hours, then I drove home. I wrote one thing in my log that evening. The bench above the canyon is empty now. The deer have moved. The trail, Dee said, goes nowhere useful. But the land remembers where it was, the grass a little worn, the rock face slightly smooth where hands have rested. You can see, if you know how to look, exactly where a person sat and looked south for a long time, and then finally turned around.